Um, okay, so I'm really delighted to introduce Rachel. Rachel is a research fellow and a PhD student in the Department of Education, University of Oslo. She's also visiting us for around 4 months while she works on some papers from her PhD, and she has a great misfortune that I'm the second supervisor for her PhD, which is how this link developed, I guess. So I think Rachel's work on learning outcomes is really interesting, and I'm really looking forward to summer.
Thank you very much.
Oh, and Rachel said if you have questions of clarification, please feel free to ask them as we go along. If there's more substantive questions, if we could leave them to the end. Okay.
Great. Yeah, I'm hoping to talk for more like 30 instead of 40 minutes and then have time for questions and discussion. So, my title today, Learning Outcomes in Universities, How Are They Interpreted and Practiced in Norway and England, is very snappy, but quite descriptive of what I'm going to try and do. Just before I start, actually, Paul's introduced me, but I'm working on a PhD and I'm about halfway through the PhD, not quite. So, the PhD I'm doing is article-based, so the expectation is I have to write 3 or 4 articles and then a sort of overarching chapter which says what do these all add up to in terms of my contribution to the area. And I'm obviously British, but I've been in Norway for about 8 years, and so that's how I've come to compare the 2 countries. But I did a master's project comparing the 2, and I think there's quite a lot of interesting kind of insights the 2 cases offer on each other. So today, there we go. My aim is to introduce my project quite briefly and then present a little bit of the results from a paper which is underway now. But then to leave some time to talk about broader challenges and choices. I feel like this point in the PhD process, I've got some decisions to make about how I kind of frame the issues I'm looking at, theories I use, the kind of bigger frameworks I build up, and how I can make the work I'm doing now more broadly applicable to things I might do afterwards. So not just think about how to study learning outcomes, but other things like learning outcomes, and how I can kind of try and bring something out of my project which is both critical and useful. And I thought you might all be quite good people to ask for suggestions and reflections on those aims. So first of all, the project. My PhD sort of sprung out the side of a project called HALO, Higher Education Learning Outcomes, which was a Norwegian project looking at the learning outcomes idea and how it's being applied and being implemented in Norway. It's a bit contemporary. No. But so learning outcomes as a topic of study in both the Norwegian project and my PhD. The reason there's an interest in them now, and the reason I'm looking at them now, is really their use in Bologna and in European reforms and the European qualifications framework. So the definition there, I mean, I'm sure you've all used learning outcomes, but the definition that's widely used is statements of what a learner is expected to know, understand, or be able to do at the end of a period learning. And there's a lot of sort of hopes and aspirations for what learning outcomes will do and how they'll be used, which particularly relate to making degrees more transparent and therefore more mobile between countries and between systems. Also to make sure that a degree means the same thing in different countries, and a general shift to say instead of focusing on inputs and activities of universities, we should look at what they actually contribute, what do they actually do. This is how we can make sure they're giving us value for money, that they're relevant, that they're contributing to the future we want to build in the European higher education area. Here's an example. Here's an example of some learning outcomes. This is a course on research methods I've been involved in teaching. And you can see that at the top, it's been cut off on this one, but at the top, this was the course content. So the first few lines is how people used to talk about their courses. They talk about the content. It's an introduction to the philosophy of social science. It's about research questions. It's about how you design research and types of designs, and an introduction to quantitative and qualitative methods. This has now got to be replaced, and in Norway this has been quite a sharp process. That has to be reformulated in learning outcomes, and specifically outcomes which refer to knowledge, skills and competencies. And I don't know, the text is quite small, but there's already things in here which suggest this might not be the most simple process. So in particular, under skills, it talks about being able to assess the appropriateness of different kinds of research designs. But then what does that mean? And it says, for instance, in terms of their appropriateness, transparency or quality. So this person's trying to elaborate beyond appropriateness and having to just fall back on a So it's not always easy to write learning outcome formulations, but we all have to. Around this issue of learning outcomes, perhaps partly because they're being kind of driven by this European agenda and changed in qualification frameworks. There's a lot of debate, questions being asked about, are they appropriate for learning at the higher education level? There's been a lot of use of them in schools, but do they kind of lift up to work at the level of higher education? Can disciplinary differences be accommodated? A lot of people have suggested they suit much more professionally oriented and bounded subjects much more than open-ended ones. And there's been discussion, in particular interesting discussion by Sin and Saunders about how the justification or the rationale for using learning outcomes has moved from them being a tool of kind of architectural change to align the formal frameworks to this tool which is expected to do a lot more change in terms of teaching process than the nitty-gritty work of higher education. The idea that learning outcomes are a way of gaining more relevance and more stakeholder input into what higher education done is difficult because no one really agrees on what the key learning outcomes should be, either over time or between different groups. When you ask employers and students and academics, you get different responses, but also over a 5 and 10 year period, what needs to be a graduate outcome changes. And finally, they're widely linked to perceived pressures for more standardisation and more measurement of higher education. It's not just about having learning outcomes, it's about having learning outcomes we can measure. In particular, the HALO project, which the organisation where I used to work was involved in the Norwegian case, and I think that highlighted some of the real challenges in making measurable learning outcomes. So gaps that my project is kind of trying to at least look at. The research and implementation of learning outcomes so far has made it very clear that once you start trying to move them beyond the sort of formal architecture level, it's quite difficult, that we don't really know what influence, if any, they're having on teachers or students or programs. And the people kind of driving the Bologna process are increasingly concerned about that actually the aspirations to develop this kind of wider change, to have this paradigm shift in teaching, to raise quality, maybe actually very little is happening at the ground level, and people have changed the formal descriptions of programs, and that's where it will stop. And this issue of disciplinary differences and national differences in the interpretation of outcomes has been discussed and is sort of recognised as being under-researched. And in particular, studies, international studies into graduate skills like a HALO and like reflex they have both found actually the patterns of graduate skills really vary across countries, and they don't even cluster in consistent ways. So the idea there is this kind of stable set of learning outcomes is questionable. So another gap, which again I want to focus on, is we talk about learning outcomes, but the people talking about learning outcomes most rarely talk about what they mean by learning, or at the policy level at least, that's an issue. Once you get down to the level of people working in departmental teaching and learning, this is an issue, but the policy is very vague, and it sort of implies learning as something you can match, something you can define quite easily, and often something you kind of organise and make measurable. So my pictures here are illustrating a kind of constructive alignment type idea over here that you can kind of model student learning in higher education in quite a neat way. My elephant climbing the ladder of Bloom's taxonomy of learning here. Bloom's taxonomy is often very popular as a way of trying to make sense of what you do when you do learning outcomes. And, you know, appropriate verbs. This lists appropriate verbs because some verbs make for good learning outcomes and some verbs are bad. And I feel like these kind of things, this is people trying to make sense of what does a learning outcome mean in practice, and it's trying to put back in some ideas about what do we mean by learning. So it's a challenging issue to study. Learning outcomes are a sort of slippery and contested topic. And I'm also not really sure what I'm studying. Am I studying the stated policy? Am I studying them as the kind of set of policy tools provided by the European agenda? Am I looking at them as a kind of broader concept or phenomenon? So they're tricky. So my approach so far has been kind of to crack on and gather some information and do some work on them, partly driven by this larger project. And my aim has been to accept all that kind of controversy and disagreement about what they are and look for how they're actually being understood and used by the people tasked with using them. So I've looked at a range of study programs and a range of different groups, and the way I've gone about it is devising a set of cases, 8 paired cases across Norway and England, where there's matching of subjects or degree program types. All my 4 institutions are fairly traditional, reasonably kind of high-ranked universities, and in each department I spoke to higher education leaders, sometimes heads of department, sometimes kind of leaders of a programme, students and lecturers. Any questions so far? So the paper I'm working on at the moment with Paul and with my supervisor in Norway, Bjørn Stensaker, is about learning outcomes and student-centred learning. And this is, can you read the text on this? Yeah, you've got it over there. There you are, it's a nice cartoon, isn't it? Paul loves the cartoons. Right, so learning outcomes are increasingly described not as a way of expressing curricula and expressing qualification frameworks, but as a driving feature of a paradigm shift. They're going to bring a paradigm shift to teaching and learning. And they're going to bring radical changes in teaching and higher education to make it more student-centred. And exactly what this means isn't always very clear. But one way of looking at that shift is about this anxiety that Bologna reforms and these attempts to make teaching and teaching excellence focus haven't really bitten. They've stayed at this level of formal changes, and they haven't really actually got into what people are doing in teaching and learning or what students are learning. But this whole idea is riven with vagueness about what do we mean when people who promote the idea that learning outcomes and student-centred learning go together. What do they mean by either of those things? Student-centred learning isn't really elaborated, and this paper tries to bring out several potential versions of what that might mean, but also the mechanisms that might link a learning outcome approach and a more student-centred kind of learning and teaching, again, isn't really elaborated, but it's kind of hinted at here and there. So the approach we've taken to look at this issue is to identify three kind of common links or mechanisms talked about in the European and Bologna documentation and the agenda around that. One is transparency, and the idea that you make different degrees more transparent. What are you going to learn? How are you going to learn it? How are you going to be assessed? This enhances student choices and also kind of makes students more able to understand that learning process. This issue of encouraging alignment, constructive alignment, where there's a much more explicitly and carefully thought out link between the aims of a programme, what you do in that programme and how it's assessed. And then this vaguer, again, sense that it's about focusing attention on the student as opposed to the teacher. And I'll come back to that one because I'm not quite sure what that means in practice. So the paper identifies these three links, which sort of come up again and again without being very clearly elaborated. It describes a range of ways you can look at student-centred learning. And then the interviews offer some evidence of how are these things playing out in practice. Do people see learning outcomes as leading to shifts which enhance student-centred learning? So student-centred learning, what does it mean? It's easy to get the impression it's just lovely. It's a really, who would argue with student-centred learning? It's about less of us as teachers and more of students. That's not massively helpful in terms of what it's actually doing. And this is a work in progress, but in the paper I'm suggesting, or we're suggesting, that there's three kind of widely used or put into action models of what student-centred learning might be. One is what the European and ENQA, particularly the European Quality Assurance Body, kind of suggests as student-centred learning. And it presents student-centred learning as SSL here. It's a kind of version of teaching and learning which is a solution to the contemporary problems of higher education. Big cohorts, more diverse students, students needing to be seen as one of many stakeholder groups, and this issue of expectation of tangible and relevant results. And student-centred learning is here seen as the way to teach and learn to deal with that wider environment. There's also an enhanced curriculum version, what we're calling an enhanced curriculum version, which is a sort of vision of student-centred learning which is much more related to the idea of good planning, that good teaching and learning results from good planning and alignment. Here I've mentioned Biggs and Ramsden, but there's others on this. And the idea that if you plan well and you have an aligned course, you'll have appropriate processes which will also be activating, they'll encourage deep learning, they'll kind of bring to bear all the kind of evidence-based bits of good teaching. And then finally this sort of engagement or emancipatory version, which is more about the way student-centred learning seemed to originally be used, more about students being brought in as having more agency and freedom to steer their learning process, the idea of teachers more as facilitators or guiders through a quite open-ended process of learning, and learning as a more kind of personal and varied project. So here things about transformative learning might fit in better. So those sort of three versions of student-centred learning seem to be around at the moment. And then the question becomes, how does learning outcomes, or how could learning outcomes relate to any of those in practice? The results from the interviews, I'm just going to present a few kind of key results on this. Firstly, the question of, are learning outcomes seen as having any influence? That's basically a kind of, there is some influence there, but it's fairly weak and it's fairly varied across the cases. And in particular, this is where the two national cases vary quite a lot. In England, the idea of learning outcomes has kind of bubbled around for ages. In Norway, it's been much more suddenly implemented as part of the new quality assurance scheme. So they've gone from no learning outcome language in higher education to all courses having to have them in the space for a few years. And the learning outcome agenda has been very tightly linked to this bigger set of changes about quality assurance. And also on the back of a series of very critical reports about the quality of teaching in higher education. So most Norwegian academics I spoke to have kind of accepted that they have a teaching problem, and learning outcomes are part of the policy solution that's coming in on the back of it. But they are being used to some extent. The challenge is that neither teachers or students are really very clear on what the meaning or the intention of them is very often. And the most common kind of way they're seen as helpful is that they're helpful for weaker or newer teachers. They're a recipe for planning a course, and they're a recipe for aligning your course, and that can be very helpful if either you've never done that before, or maybe you've never really felt like your students are getting much out of your courses, or in some cases people talk about more traditional teachers being kind of forced to up.
Okay, so we won't take a break between the end of Rachel's presentation.
Yes.
So if you do want more refreshments, please either have them sent now or as we go along.
Yeah, as we go along, fine.
And I'll hand back to you.
So, we were talking about awkward aspects of the learning outcomes and the idea of teaching enhancement or teaching change from the interviews. So this variety and idiosyncrasy, students see that as a good thing and sort of see that at the point at which they start to recognise they're learning something that matters to them. But people involved in teaching also talked about the challenge of a learning outcome approach when it comes to the need to leave room for flexibility and judgment in what counts as a good performance. So there was a sense that learning outcomes can help map a kind of reasonable performance by the average student. But what about students who excel in ways you don't expect, or who write a really great essay which doesn't really meet the learning outcomes but you think does maybe something more important, or who take a different approach to the course material than you've seen before, or who go and do a lot of reading? There's lots of ways you can do it, but how do you accommodate that? And so the conclusion sort of so far from that paper is that there is an impact on teaching practice, but it's fairly limited, and it's fairly contingent on people's immediate setting. They're interpreting the kind of current on their teaching practice or the department's teaching practice. There's a sense it really can be useful for less experienced or less competent teachers, and it can, because it had to be done, because it's a change that has to be done, particularly in Norway where it's been a much sharper change, it's an opportunity to stop and reflect about teaching practice and review course materials, and that can be helpful in itself. And the implied mechanisms I mentioned, these three mechanisms or kind of links of transparency, alignment, and this more of a focus on students, they are visible in the interviews. People do talk about changes linked to working with learning outcomes that reflect all of those. But it doesn't feel like when you put that together, the teachers or the students see that as a huge change. They don't feel there's been a paradigm shift in their teaching. They don't feel like it's radically changed what they do. And partly this is because the meaning and intent of a learning outcome approach is so vague. It's very unclear what the wider meaning of those approaches are, what is it aiming at. And so it ends up with a question of who gets to define what goes in the learning outcomes and what a wider version of a learning outcome approach or a student-centred approach means in practice. And that adds up to an ambiguous relationship with student-centred learning, and in particular any more sort of a fuller version of student-centred learning. The three versions set out of this kind of a solution to contemporary problems in Europe or an alignment model, there are some credible links there that learning outcomes and student-centred learning go together. But the question of whether they empower students, whether they lead to transformative learning, whether they make a kind of bigger shift in the relationship between teachers and students, it's pretty unclear that they're doing anything that would do that. And in particular, I think one thing that comes out is they divert attention from the issues that teachers and students see as crucial to teaching quality or to learning quality. And that is a bit tricky. So that's the end of that section on the student-centred learning and learning outcomes paper. Any clarifications on that before I do the last bit? Okay. So broader challenges and choices, partly because I'm here and in a new environment and away from my home department and things, I've been thinking about the kind of bigger challenges in the project and the choices I have to make so I can now move forward, write some papers and try and present a kind of a PhD which sort of fits together as a wider project as well as a set of articles. And also a bit more about the kind of what sort of research am I trying to do here. And the two things I think I've really been thinking about is I'm not really just interested in learning outcomes as a topic in themselves, but I think they're interesting as a type of policy or a type of reform that comes up in higher education a lot. And I'm interested in thinking about how you can research things like learning outcomes, these sort of things presented as policy tools which have attached to them all sorts of contradictory ideas and bigger agendas, which are often not made very explicit and which make it very hard to predict what they're going to do in practice. And I think also I've been thinking about wanting my research to be critical and sort of problematise these issues, but also still be useful because people are having to work with learning outcomes. And it would be great if some of the things I can take out of the interviews make it easier for people to understand the options for how you could work with learning outcomes or ways to use them in a way which gives them more of a sense of the potential wider implications of learning outcomes instead of them being used in this very plonky way. Plonky. There you are, that's an analytically scientific term. So my work so far has sort of underlined for me that there's huge gaps between the stated, intended and actual influence of learning outcomes. And there's these very vague mechanisms of influence, and it feels very useful to me to start saying, okay, how, in practice, what is the sort of thinking about how a learning outcome changes teaching practice or changes the student experience? So I want to use approaches or lenses that focus on the active translation of learning outcomes and how they're translated in specific settings. Keep looking at implementation as a dynamic process. It's not like you roll out learning outcomes, they're written in the qualification framework, done. There's an ongoing negotiation in both countries about trying to work out how you write your learning outcomes for individual courses, but then how do you do them for whole degree programs, and then how do you ladder them up to perhaps a whole university having graduate outcomes across all courses, and how do you ladder them down to individual lectures or to teaching events. And it's a big process that no one's really finished with and no one's quite clear on. And I sort of said the previous thing. I have to acknowledge that there are positive things coming out about people's use of learning outcomes, while there's also very big questions about the bigger implications of them or the bigger influence they might have. So, I like this. I stole this picture. Someone was talking about success, and I thought it worked well for learning. In the project, I want to actually try and bring back in sort of mess and people and power, because I think a lot of the research I see done on these topics, and perhaps some of the research done in my home environment, is very nervous of mess and people. And I think it's quite useful to look at that when you're talking about implementation, because this kind of idea of learning is this sort of squiggly, contorted process. That feels more real to me. And I also think that gets more at this idea of what learning feels like to students in a positive way. That messy, tangled line isn't all bad. There is confusion in there, but there's also, that's how you get to the bits that matter. I think a lot of people who, if they drew their learning experience at university as a straight line, I would question how many of them had had a kind of rich, life-changing, transformative, real experience. Go on, there we go. My original thoughts about theory. I am not a theoretically sophisticated researcher. I've come in from doing lots of research. I've done lots of interview-based research in previous jobs. But I struggle with the kind of academic bit of having a disciplinary hat or a set of theories I'm very used to and use well. So my initial thoughts about theory were a bit all over the place. And I looked at pedagogic theories, like, constructive alignment of bigs, and I looked at organisational theories and institutional theories about how learning outcomes were a policy and management tool, and comparative policy theories. And I didn't really feel like they were kind of helping me get at the bits of the topic which are most interesting. And also I didn't know how to fit them all together without some incredibly unwieldy process. So I think I've moved on from these a bit. Go on. I'll just use that. So, what do I think now? What do I now think I mean by policy and implementation? I think I found a sort of set of discussions around this which feel very useful and very appropriate for learning outcomes. I started off looking at Stephen Ball and his talking about policy use in practice, about being very contingent, about policy as both text and discourse, and this idea that policies in practice move between being fairly fixed, so in learning outcomes in a qualification framework or a course description, and then this ongoing negotiated varied understanding. I also found some interesting work on translation and policy moving kind of from the European level to the national level or moving around the world. This idea of translation and template. So learning outcomes is a template, a very thin sort of sketch of a policy which has to be filled out in practice. And actually the people who fill it out in different ways. And then recently, I've been reading a lot of work by Murray Saunders and Paul Trowler and Christina Sin, who are all linked here. And I think the implementation staircase that Paul mentioned to me months and months ago, and this idea of looking at policy in terms of social practice, that feels a very useful way of capturing some of the things I've got happening in the papers anyway, and kind of underlining the contingent and contextual way that policy is made sense of and therefore used in different ways. Vagueness and power I've talked about a bit. I keep coming back to this. I think I'm always a bit suspicious when no one talks about power in issues of policy change, particularly where you have things like the European policy changes being kind of encouraged. And, you know, I found this is a nice quote that came up about nothing is more false than the claim that for a given assertion its use is its meaning. What was the best bit there? Yeah. Its possession of wholly different and incompatible meanings in different contexts, and the fact that at the same time, as it were, it emits the impression of possessing a consistent meaning. I think that's really important. The learning outcomes are presented as though they're uncontroversial, they're a very neat, tidy thing. They lead to harmonization and more consistency. And then in practice, actually, it's kind of, you know, whoever has the biggest stick gets to determine what the learning outcomes are to some extent in different settings, and that's problematic. And then recently I started reading Biesta talking about power. So you can see power being enacted in higher education practice when you look at the reduction of complexity. So the act of making a complex thing less complex is an act of power, and it's about who then gets to do that defining. See, we have some Biesta. How to look at learning. Thinking, so I'm sort of developing a sense of what I mean by learning and therefore what I can kind of hold up as a comparison to learning outcomes. Gregory Bateson talks about learning in an interesting way. He's quite kind of highfalutin and philosophical about it, but I think it's very illuminating on the learning outcome idea because he is very much about learning as a kind of holistic process where you have several kind of nested loops of learning happening all the time. You can never learn a specific skill or a specific thing because you're always also learning a bigger pattern in learning that one thing, and you're learning a bigger set of sort of meta learning or looking for patterns as you learn specific things. And he talks about mistaking the map for the territory when we try and make sense of complicated things going on. We map it out and we simplify it, but in doing that, if we completely misunderstand the mechanisms of what's going on there, we risk then building ourselves a map that doesn't make sense. I think I'm going to have that kind of bubbling away in the background, but that's not going to be in the papers. But I think an expression of learning much more in a practical way about how universities do learning is a book on the University of Learning by Bowden and Martin, and I think actually they're talking about a very similar idea about what learning is. And they offer a very different take on learning outcomes, and we're going to try and write a paper. We are going to write a paper on that for SRHE, trying to present a different way of using learning outcomes, which has a much more explicit model of what do we mean by learning, what is the learning process about. And the kind of results I'm aiming at, I'd like to be, you know, critical and useful. And I've been kind of asked a lot, well, you know, you can't say you can't make causal interpretations about learning outcomes at the European level, therefore driving the impacts or changes you're finding in your interviews. And I've realised the answer to that is I agree, you can't, and I'm not trying to, that's fine. But the idea of provisional stabilities I read about recently, and I think that sums up maybe what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to find credible and hopefully interesting descriptions of what's actually going on, suggest some mechanisms about what's happening in practice, and maybe offer some useful metaphors. And I think that's the end. That's the end. That's where I'm up to. So I'm at a point in my project where very little is actually fixed. So I'm very open to criticism, comments, questions, because I can change direction or do various things differently. So there you go.
Okay. Thank you, Rachel. So we now have plenty of time for questions and discussions. Thank you for such a rich and thought-provoking presentation. I think there's lots of really interesting ideas for us to explore there. So who would like to kick us off? Brett.
Thanks, that was a really interesting presentation. I suppose, in my head I have two questions. I'm going to ask one of them and maybe come back later if there's time. So the first one is an analogy that I suppose is in my head with the area of assessment.
Yeah.
Which of course is not entirely unconnected at all. But there's been perhaps a very long history as well of trying to make assessment very much more codified.
Yeah.
Of introducing more and more complex coding schemes, especially as certain problems of scale have meant that you have large marking teams, so you're always trying to create a sense of reliability, which is really analogous here. Now, in the assessment literature, there's a lot of discussion about something called the backwash effect, which is to say that actually as you codify, not only does that affect teaching, they're much more certain of that than I think you are about learning outcomes, but potentially it affects teaching and learning in a negative way.
Yeah.
So it's basically like saying because the test has to be like this and because teachers have to teach to certain granular questions, in mathematics where I'm more familiar with the debates, it generally means teaching much more granular mathematical facts and teaching less about how mathematical narratives are constructed over time. And I wondered whether a similar thing is going on here, whether learning outcomes are increasingly created as these very, very complex edifices that cause a teacher to then, having sat there in a committee, probably with some mirth, thinking of precise ways of trying to phrase these things, that afterwards they have the power to say that actually some other teacher or even the same teacher a year later can't do things that are clearly worthwhile. So I wonder whether it's not, I'm sure that there is some doubt about how much this is really changing anything, but I wonder whether there's also something about looking whether it could change things in a backwash kind of read negative kind of way.
Yes, I think that's a very interesting point, and that the links with assessment are very important. And I was talking to Anne-Marie the other day, and I think assessment is very important because it kind of comes in as a tipping point between a different version of learning outcomes. One where they are a kind of teaching and planning tool, and they're open to negotiation. And okay, you have to write them down on a piece of paper. Essentially, you can revisit them and update them. Once you start bringing in measurement and particular standardised measurement, they get very fixed. And once they're fixed, all sorts of things follow from that. One being that people can't negotiate them anymore, but another being exactly these kind of backwash effects, in that the students and the teachers then know what to expect in ways which can become problematic. So teaching to the test, but also students looking at learning outcomes so they know, okay, well, those are the things I have to do and I'm not going to do anything else. But also the kind of information provided from a learning outcome approach changes a lot once they become very fixed. So no, I think that's a very good parallel to look at, and actually there might be quite a lot of interesting work there about how you get at this, how this sort of spectrum is from describing learning in more open ways to that kind of granularity and that kind of breaking down that feels problematic both for how it changes how teachers and students act, but also for how it fails to capture some of the more important bits of learning. So I definitely could have a look at that. Yes.
Sue?
Well, I'd like to comment on, in a way, on that. I think one of the reasons that the UK to date has rejected the hello approach, certainly to standardised testing, is because people don't want that kind of restriction on their curriculum, and I can't see that changing in a hurry. It would be interesting, but they've made it very clear. And I say they, I'm not even quite sure who they is, but maybe it's QA or someone that they'll reject it. I'm really interested in this because I've been doing all this work on assessment criteria, which is exactly the same. It's an attempt to kind of codify, in a sense, in a way. At its best, it's about trying to make things transparent and fair, but at its worst, it becomes people use the terms. Well, we all assume we understand the same things from it, and we don't have that. So it's really interesting. But I wonder whether you saw any difference with professional programs. I'm thinking of things like medicine now, where there's been huge efforts to try and really clarify exactly what a qualifying doctor will be competent. I think of some of the stuff they've done in Maastricht, and So not focusing on like getting every module outcome at every module level, but the overall thing, and whether that differs very much from, say, the average history degree or English degree, which is made up of the research interests, probably of the teaching staff. I don't know.
No, that did definitely come out, and the disciplinary difference bit, I don't feel I've sort of made the most of that in the analysis I've done so far, but the subjects I had, STEM subjects were quite applied, and I think the thing that they found much easier was there was already a big set of all students have to know this stuff, and that came from professional organisations and professional bodies, and they had kind of a set of things that everyone just has to know, and that's always been there. So it made a big part of their curriculum already kind of ready to write in learning outcomes that all students for any university had to have. But even they talked a lot about finding it quite difficult to capture some of the bits of learning they thought were important, and in particular they talked about how they felt their STEM degree was different from other degrees of the same type at different institutions. So one was very focused on the idea that the professionals they were kind of creating had to go and work with other professionals from related but different fields, and that a key skill was about negotiating between those different perspectives on the same work practice. And they didn't really know how to capture that, and instead they kind of ignored it in their learning outcomes, and they just had a lot of activities and a lot of practice in their programme where they were trying to teach that skill, but that skill was invisible on the written materials. And they also said the problem with that was it was invisible in when students came to talk about themselves. So they were trying to find ways of not necessarily writing it in as a learning outcome, but encouraging their students to see that they had a set of skills there which weren't present for all students from the same degree. But yeah, I think it's very difficult, and certainly in some of the less kind of profession-defined courses, there was a real sense that it's very hard to get the people teaching across the course to agree, because actually it's much more diverse, and particularly students have this huge array of modules to take, and so they're not going to come up with the same set of skills, because they might specialise quite early on in very different kind of clusters of courses. And that was definitely a problem. And in those departments, they generally had the kind of degree level outcomes were very thin, and kind of no one believed in them, but no one really thought they mattered. And it was the course level ones that mattered. Whereas in other subjects, it had been easy to say, okay, these are degree level outcomes, but everyone knows those aren't the full picture. So there's this ongoing negotiation between the levels. But yes, I think the disciplines negotiate very differently. But I didn't expect actually how much all of the disciplines said things along the lines of, well, but in our subject it's really difficult to do this because we're special. And there was a science in particular where they were like, well, we're not, you might see us as one subject, but actually I'm completely different from that group, and they couldn't understand. So they see themselves as creating very different people through the degrees, which would sit in the same department right next to each other. So it's not just about professional and kind of more open subjects, but that does play a role.
Sure.
Thanks. Like Brett, I've got at least 2 questions, but I'll limit myself to one at this stage. I think the reason this is also fascinating, even though I think you'd agree there's a bit of us that thinks learning outcomes fascinating. I think the reason it is because of this tension between the positive and the negative. And certainly in my own experience, when I worked as an educational developer, and I was teaching courses, I'm designing courses, assessing courses. I think I've told you, I would move always between being poacher and gamekeeper. So when I would have, someone from physics say learning outcomes were a load of rubbish, I would, no, this is a very useful thing. When I would have someone from management saying everyone was hot, oh God, we've got to critique this rubbish. And so, it's that constant tension is one I can't get rid of myself, though I suppose I've come to my own realisation of it. So that's just a bit of background. But one of the things that struck me, and I don't know if this is just in who you spoke to, is that it's as if everybody is talking about learning outcomes and using them and thinking about them. Whereas in my research I've done with students and with academics, certainly a lot of academics, I mean, for, the typical thing, they're given a course and they're not given the course descriptor because that will confuse them. Say they're kind or senior colleagues. That's a different institution I used to work at. The same with students. When we did a project to give students a chance to, if they wanted to rewrite these things, they didn't know what they were, and they weren't the least bit interested in getting to know them. So I suppose if I could just smooth that into my second question then. Right, so first, do you agree with that? You've talked about
absolutely.
But there's a big silence of those who...
And I've had this terror. The first few interviews I did in England were terrifying because I go in and say, so I'd like to ask you some questions about learning outcomes. And the first thing people would say would be, oh, I don't really know anything about them. We don't really use them. No, I have no view. And then as we started talking about it, they did, and they had to use them, but they're not sort of top of mind in England in the way they are in Norway, where they've kind of landed with a great thunk in everyone's practice.
I think that was the second point, that the notion of learning outcomes as a policy tool presupposes that they have a certain obviousness and place in people's day-to-day practice. And I don't think that's true in the UK context in the same way. And I was struck, are you suggesting that in Norway these very much have come in as, in a sense, a top-down policy tool to change? Because I think people in Britain would think, those who would think that learning outcomes were part of a teaching innovation.
Yeah.
And the idea that it was a policy manoeuvre to get them to change their behaviour, which it may well have been.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's how it's perceived at all.
No, I think that's really true, and I think that's something I've got to address somewhere, because I do think it's problematic that I'm saying I'm comparing the same, I don't know, see, that's the thing, I don't really know what to call them, a policy, and the same policy, but actually it's not the same policy in the two countries, really, and never was, and the way it's kind of arrived. I've been working on a joint paper with some colleagues, and it started off as being called the landing of a policy instrument about learning outcomes, and now it's kind of the shaping of a policy tool. But it's all about the fact that they've kind of come in from different directions and over completely different time frames. And I think you're right. I think here they've kind of come in from several directions into higher education, and in a different way, and more of a kind of one of many approaches you can use to think about teaching. And I also think there's an interesting thing that in England, academics persistently look away from the European influence on changes and say it's not we aren't affected by it. We're in Bologna, but that's everyone else becoming like us, and that's been kind of well evidenced. And I think part of the not seeing them as part of that kind of European agenda is real, that they were here before and have been used in a different way, and part of it's a kind of a bigger kind of blind spot about the influence of Europe, perhaps. In Norway, it's been much more explicit and much more top-down. And that in itself is interesting, that Norway, where, the thinking goes, academics there have much more professional autonomy. They are not given to accepting top-down reorganisation. Universities have more autonomy and kind of more kickback on these things. In the case of learning outcomes and the qualification frameworks, it's kind of been the opposite, that the Norwegians have really been like the best students in the class, actually along with the Swedes, and they have grabbed the idea, implemented it very strongly, not really tolerated academics saying, but my subject doesn't fit and a learning outcome is reductive. They've just said, we'll do it anyway. So I think I think that's a really important problem in this, that they're not really a policy tool, and I can't really pretend they kind of land in that way. So it's how to get at that they're sort of different things in different countries while still comparing how people perceive and use them.
And let's see, has a question, because can I come back, because I'm not so sure they are a policy tool.
Well, I just think if you go back to the late 90s, that's exactly what they were in this country, and it was all linked to the, the introduction originally of the QA, whatever it was called, quality, I can tell you the name, and then which became the QAA, and the introduction of the, basically after the Deering report,
when they made the grand new framework.
Yeah, absolutely. And even institutions like this, I know because my own band worked on it, had a sort of 6 subjects project where they all had to work out their program specifications and such like. So I just think we're at a different point.
Yeah.
And I also think again, having worked in a very much a non-elite institution, every academic member of staff there would be very attuned into learning outcomes and all that stuff. So maybe by talking to the more elite institutions in this country, which that maybe have a greater confidence in their own subject areas and their own disciplines, have been better able to resist that than perhaps in some of the newer institutions. So I do think it was a policy thing, but it's drifted, and maybe people have, well, you know, I absolutely agree what you say about program level stuff. I don't think anyone takes the slightest bit of notice of program level outcomes. They just care about their own modules, which works completely against what the policy was trying to do, which was to give students coherent experiences originally.
I think, as Sue sort of implies, in the UK you have to read them in relation to subject benchmarks.
Absolutely, absolutely.
That's the crucial bit in the UK story, is the role of subject benchmarks and the production of those, and who was involved in producing those in different disciplines is crucial to the way.
And how contested that process was. Someone's written about that. I can't remember who that is now.
But it's interesting because this process is kind of what this paper I worked on with some other colleagues before. That's sort of what I thought the paper was going to be, and it's ended up being a completely different paper, much more focused on different kind of policy-making regimes in the two countries. But I think there's a sort of historical story about how they've come in different ways, which is very important to put in somewhere. And I spoke to Mary Henkel, and she was saying very similar things to both of you about this, because they've been kind of, I want to say, kicking about in the UK. But
Yeah,
they have been
20
kicking
years,
about.
really.
That you have to see people's current view of them in light of that bits of them have been picked up again and new pressure put on them by recent changes, but actually the idea is not new. I think I need to think about how to get that across. And you're the second person to mention about how, you know, maybe less elite institutions feel this more keenly or have it as more explicit thing.
Yeah, my original question was really go back to what you said about them being seen as a solution to a problem in Norway, and I was just curious about what that problem was. But as the discussion's gone on, it's kind of turned into a rather cynical view that one of the reasons why people latch on to learning outcomes is that they're very easy to use as a solution to almost any problem that you think you might have. And those problems vary. So, you know, in my job, one of the things that people have to do when they come to see me is to persuade me that a new program, a new module is fit for purpose. And even though I don't really care one way or another about learning outcomes, they are required to demonstrate that they got them. So being able to use the language gives them a means of solving that particular problem. Relatively new, low-status universities have a problem establishing themselves, so it gives them a way of solving that problem, which is a problem that we like to think we don't have. And so on and so forth. So people at European level, presumably, the Bologna people, they assume that there's a problem about having a great mass of different programs that people need to change between, so they need to find some way of standardizing them, so learning outcomes is a solution to that one. One of the reasons then why they're so readily adapted is that nobody actually thinks the slightest bit of difference to anything at all. So you can adopt them, use the language, which is again, I think, why you might find new teachers find them helpful. I mean, when I started, 40 years ago, I was asked to go and teach something, and I didn't have any conceptual terms in which to talk about it, and that was quite worrying. Having a set of learning outcomes wouldn't actually help me in the slightest, I don't think, looking back on it, to have done what I did any better, but it would have given me some terminology to talk about it, so I would feel a little bit more comfortable to have a conversation with someone, because we both knew where to start. Yeah. So, what was the problem that the Norwegians saw?
So, in Norway, essentially there's been a pretty sharp wave of quality reforms. So there were a series of critical reviews of higher education in Norway, and the conclusion was made that a system-wide quality lift was needed, and part of the concern was that Norway had drifted a long way from what most European countries are doing. So they had longer degrees, they had an awful lot of people stopping and starting, changing tracks, not completing, though the not completing actually turned out to be a lot of people going, oh, I picked the wrong degree, I'll go and do something else, oh, I'm happier now. So there was a lot of concern about that, and the quality assurance agenda sort of started out more in terms of the structural bits, and now the concern is that teaching isn't good enough, and that there's been so much focus on the research roles in universities and enhancing quality there, and research is the kind of driver of quality of the whole institution, that now a new set of tools is needed by the Norwegian quality assurance body, NOKUT, to make sure that teaching quality is a focus. And it's essentially a series of reforms which just make departments think about teaching and review their teaching, and the learning outcomes have come in there because it's a way of saying all programs have to be picked up, dusted off, looked at and aligned. So this issue of having, so the process you're saying is happening in the 90s, of saying how do we make these modules add up to a degree that makes sense, is being done kind of now. And previously teaching was much more, people talk about being privatised and courses being people's hobby courses. You weren't really expected to say how your module in a history degree contributed to the wider degree outcomes. And that's sort of happening in the last few years. And that's driven by a sense that teaching isn't good enough, that most of the people I spoke to have kind of bought into. So it's not really a matter of people saying, oh, the politicians are trying to tell us we have to change and there's no need. A lot of people accept that there's at least quite significant corners of bad teaching. And I agree with you that they are useful, but I think part of the reason they're useful is that there's not really, in a lot of places, there's not really a wider discussion about what are we trying to do with the learning on a bigger level than teach the course. And by offering that kind of solution to many problems, they can be useful, but they also take the space for other things that could be offered to people. So new teachers, actually giving them learning outcomes gives them a recipe, but does it necessarily help them to understand the learning process of what they're trying to get at in any bigger way? Probably not, but then the ways of doing that might be more resource heavy and not very possible. I'm not sure. So I think it's quite tricky, because they are useful, but they're also, I don't know, I think they kind of provide this sort of veneer of organisation and clarity, and underneath it people are still paddling away madly, guessing what they're doing a lot of the time, which might not matter. Maybe that's all right.
We'll probably round to Brett's second question now, if you want.
Okay. It seemed to me that what Colin was talking about was, I know you were looking around at different theoretical frameworks, was some sort of learning outcomes as a boundary object or something like that. I don't think we've ever looked into that, but the way in which these things mediate the different actors. Part of my question, which I'm going to slightly change tack because inevitably it's been partly addressed. So the remaining bit that I think has not been touched on at all is the role, so how do learning outcomes get constructed, as it were? And you were talking about something which I've experienced depressingly myself, which is looking up things on Bloom's taxonomy and so on. And it's ironic that you know, as far as I'm aware, at least around anywhere I've ever been, most educational researchers don't spend much time thinking of Bloom's taxonomy, but as soon as we design our courses, you have to go to this. Now, another taxonomy that you mentioned later, which I find much more interesting, is Bateson's taxonomy. Now, that's much more challenging, to the extent that you seem to be saying you probably wouldn't pursue it.
No, I not at all, but I don't think it's not something you can kind of wheel out to frame an article, because I'm doing an article-based PhD, but it's definitely,
Now, it seems to me that what you've got here is that there's always been learning outcomes, right? I don't think we're introducing learning outcomes. What we're introducing is, if we're introducing 20 years ago, but, you know, still use the word introducing, we're introducing the formalised specification of learning outcomes in advance, something like that. As opposed to, that's the actual thing here. And the thing about Bateson's kind of taxonomy is that these kind of gradual correction of people according to giving them right or wrong answers, or encouragement and selective discouragement, is actually only the lower levels of his, you know, that's learning 2 or something like that in Bates.
A lot of it's learning 0.
Well, learning 0 is no differential format. So, but the point is, as you get higher and higher, it involves increasingly challenging what's going on and increasingly learning what doesn't exist when you start learning, if that makes sense. It involves not only learning but invention, creation and things like that. And I guess my knee-jerk reaction, which I may be wrong, but is that learning outcomes are in principle incapable of capturing the higher levels in Bateson's taxonomy. Actually, not just that the typical ones don't, but in principle are incapable of that. I might be wrong, but I do wonder whether people could capture the kind of higher levels that involve cultural challenge of Bateson's taxonomy in learning outcomes. I suspect they can't. And that comes into all sorts of theories in education. For example, Engerstrom's expansive learning is exactly based on a kind of collective attempt to learn something that doesn't exist yet, and the learning happens across a collective of people, not individuals, and so on. So I think it's that grasping of those higher level challenges, the collective of the not known in advance, that I think learning outcomes really struggle with. And I worry whether what we're really doing is saying, well, we're just going to step back as educationalists from some of those challenges, you know, because they're not mandated for.
I think that's an excellent point, and I think that's sort of what we're going to try and get at in this SRHE paper, that how do you, a very different form of learning outcomes would say exactly that actually a lot of the learning which we really want to strive for, and not only academics want to strive for, but a lot of these aims of relevance and graduates who are flexible and adaptable and can make use of their knowledge in different settings, that requires that kind of higher order learning, and there's a danger of squeezing it out by making learning outcomes too kind of granular and too specific. I actually kind of wrote a paper on that for my philosophy of science course, but I think this thing about orders of learning is really important, because a lot of the time actually students are asked to repeat, they're supposed to perform the same skills again and again, and that in Bateson's terms isn't learning. When you're performing the same thing that you've done before, that's not actually learning, it has to be new. I think it might be being a bit too hard on learning outcomes to say in principle they can't ever accommodate higher order learning, but I think in practice they're rarely used in a way that can. As soon as you harness them to things like Bloom's taxonomy, or as soon as you harness them to quite a kind of clumpy version of constructive alignment, then I think you can't, because it's that thing of saying these are all the outcomes there are going to be. Anything else is irrelevant. At that point they don't do well to capture any higher order learning. But it's good to hear that the Bateson model kind of chimes with those challenges in learning outcomes, but we will do some more.
So, I mean, to me, it seems that last point is important. It's not so much the statement of the learning outcome, but it's the consequences of having stated it.
Yeah.
In terms of what you're then expected to do with it, that becomes the problem. Because if the next question is, well, that's the learning outcome, how are you going to demonstrate that it's been achieved?
Yeah.
Then the more vague and general the learning outcome is, by definition, the harder it is to demonstrate that it's been achieved in a way that you can do before students graduate. You might be able to demonstrate it by the time they're retiring, not by the time they're graduating. So it's not a problem of the learning outcome; it's a problem of the consequences of stating one on the expectations that it generates.
On how so the thing that interests me is in your example slide, easy split knowledge skills. Not commented on.
No.
Yeah. And actually that first move, game's over. The second you think that knowledge, skills and competences can be separated from each other, and different skills and competences I particularly struggle with, but all three of them, they're not actually that different. They're different ways of describing the same thing. And so the second you make that move to say that split, then actually they can't do those things. Because the second you want to make those your main categories, then actually that pushes you in directions that places limits around what you can do with them.
Yeah.
And there's another. Sorry,
go on. You carry on.
There's another issue on this, which is to do with your kind of talk about the relationship with student-centered learning, because it does often seem to me, in fact, the use of learning outcomes has the exact opposite effect. It makes it more and more difficult for people to engage or to encourage genuinely student-centered learning, because of the expectation that having stated your learning outcomes thing will very well show that they've been achieved, so you have to control the students to make sure that they demonstrate the right things. But it's the ability to, we're going back to the points making about how they might be, learning outcomes might be helpful to the relatively novice teacher in higher education, because it gives them a language, a way to talk about what they're trying to do, even if they don't necessarily understand it very much. There's a sense in which the same is true for students, that it gives students the ability to think about what they have themselves learned, which is a very different way of talking about the learning outcomes. And students will tell you what the learning outcomes are, but they very often don't have a language, a set of concepts that enables them to make those kinds of observations. So the generation of the capacity to generate learning outcomes is perhaps the higher order learning outcome that you're looking for.
I mean, following your point and the early point, I mean, about higher order learning outcomes, I think actually if you read a set of learning outcomes that get through validation or whatever, often they're actually pretty demanding. They're written because people feel they need to have all these students critically analysing and theorising and what have you. And some of the research on marking is quite interesting, because it shows that new academics who are trying to look very closely for the meeting of the learning outcomes are the ones who are marking really hard, because students don't do them, and the established academics, who generally speaking don't even look at them when they're marking, but also have a we might call more realistic view of actually what's possible. So by writing things down, people have, one way of thinking about it is they're actually forced to up the to sort of make it more than actually the majority of students ever do actually achieve, because well, we want to look like we do something of a good quality. So that, again, I think that people don't, once, I mean, there's a really interesting paper by Jowett, that's how I pronounce it, South African, about how staff gradually learn to do it like the established people and to stop worrying about all this stuff that's written down.
And that's also about to the range.
Yeah.
And, you see that in the PhD exam particularly. The only PhD you know is yours, and in your mind it's much better than it actually is.
Yeah.
When you come to exam the PhD, you're ridiculously hard because you've not seen all the different ways of exhibiting PhD-ness.
But so my first experience of examining a master's student was exactly that, because I looked at the marking rubric, and she clearly hadn't done the top 2 levels of the marking rubric, so I was like, well, we can't give her more than a C, and the external examiner agreed with me, and the department were furious because she was an A-grade student.
Yeah.
And but I think that's very interesting, because I think this thing about my colleague Tina Poets has done this nice 4-part model about learning outcomes and the range of potential uses, and it spans, measurable, very hard sort of fixed outcomes to very open-ended. It can be anything, and it's this range from teaching tool to tool for management and steering as well. So in principle, you can really have anything written as a learning outcome, I guess. But some things, when you try and write them as learning outcomes, people really struggle, and it's almost like they start to feel silly. So developing a critical perspective as a professional able to negotiate with, I don't know, like some of the things people think are most important, they really struggle to write down, and they feel kind of silly about it. But not just that, as they write them, they become conscious of the fact they cannot write a marking rubric for it. So then they kind of go, oh, maybe we'll leave it away. And people talked again and again about this issue of actually, no matter how much we specify it, a lot of this comes down to judgment, and the boundaries between okay students and exceptional students is always going to be this question of judgment. And I feel to some extent like the whole learning outcome agenda and the wider moves about transparency is sort of chasing this moving target of trying to make transparent and fair and concrete and explicable all decisions. And it's just never going to happen, because every essay to be written in the world hasn't been written, and people, ultimately, you have to let people make judgments. And I think that's where this kind of novice teacher thing can be illuminating, because it is the difference between following a rubric and using judgment built up over time. And actually, someone needs to make the case that neither of those things is inherently better or worse, that both are important, that it's problematic when academics just read the first paragraph and go, well, I know this is a C, but it's also problematic for new academics to do a good marking of a paper because they're just using the rubric, and you need both. So I think it brings up those bigger questions, but I don't know. I'm mixed about where the learning outcomes can, in principle, accommodate anything, because as soon as they start trying to be used, actually, people kind of go, they shuffle away the really difficult ones.
I think the other thing to bear in mind with that as well is that experienced markers tend to, I think, they tend to make a global judgment of the quality, and then they justify it as the criteria. That's what they do. And whereas inexperienced start with criteria and then that's the global. So they're completely different processes.
Yeah, that's exactly what we found.
We do have differences across disciplines in that respect. I mean, because I was listening to one of our Pro Vice Chancellors just the other day saying that he's never marked an essay in his life, but he has added up lots of scores on individual tests and decided whether someone gets first or a 2-1.
If they're individual tests.
Subject.
Yes.
Jan, do you have time?
You'll be.
Well, it was just sort of back to actually what you were talking about just then about transparency. I think relates to this. I really like Marilyn Strathern's work about audit culture.
Oh yeah.
And so when you were talking about the extent, when I read the extent to which this was or wasn't explicitly a policy move in this country compared to Norway.
Yeah.
It just, I think there's an interesting thing here that as it has been explained, it did come in as a policy initiative, and I would argue it came in as at a time when we have policy that was moving us towards more an audit culture of higher education, and so it was there. But I suppose what I was trying to say is that a lot of people on the ground here, particularly the people who were, meant to be the champions of learning outcomes, like educational developers and that, I don't think they saw that They felt very much like this was an educational innovation. That they were doing this for the, they were on the side of the angels, and they were completely unaware of what I might argue, that there was actually a policy dimension that this was coming in, and that was going to be part of many other audit-driven approaches to policies.
That's
So there's a mismatch.
And that was also related to the early stages of development of educational development at universities as a sort of professional field, and needing to find a specialist body of knowledge that was theirs to give them the legitimacy to speak. So I think, I think you can make quite an interesting case that actually, some of that was to say, okay, here's something we know about. Is our specialised knowledge that also motivated their engagement. Not in a cynical way, but just in a you've got to represent yourself professionally.
But the angels bit, excuse me, was, because I was one of those people, was about transparency for students. Because prior to that, really, students didn't have a clue. And to be honest, I still think they don't, because it hasn't worked. But it was about helping students know what they needed to do in order to succeed. So I also agree with you, though, that it was something that gave us shape and made us needed, so to speak, in institutions.
I think it's just about they provide solutions to just about everybody's problem.
Yeah.
You have the problem of establishing yourself. Politicians with whom I do have some sympathy are under great pressure to do something about education. And so this is one way of doing something, which makes sense to other people that other people are going to be willing to work with.
But I think the difficult thing is they can be used in a very cynical way, or in a very, kind of in this side of the angels thing. I think, they can be seen as actually this is really a way to make people think about their teaching. And sometimes people who are reluctant to think about their teaching and prioritise their teaching. And then maybe with politicians as well, it's a similar thing that we need to do something about the quality of universities. This is a thing, let's do it. But I also think there's a cynical thing that the who gets to define what they mean and how they're used is always problematic. Because it's probably not who you'd want to define it.
No, you're always going to come back to power relationships in the end, aren't you?
Yeah.
But if you go back to your thing in Norway, you were saying that, in a sense, what was wanted was people to sort of take down and dust off their teaching and courses. What would have happened if they just said, okay, take down and dust off your courses and come back and show us what you've done?
Well,
would it have been any different?
Yes, because it's also linked to reasons. So actually, they didn't just want to do that. They also wanted to cut about 20 to 30% of the courses because it was seen as too kind of repetitive and too kind of diverse, and they needed to make the offer narrower. I suspect part of it was actually wanting to encourage some people into retirement, and they wanted to kind of get rid of some people. So it's a bigger set of changes than just that. But they did basically send people off. They said, go away, write your learning outcomes, then we'll have an away day, or we'll have a department meeting. And it was quite a heavy process. And then they got to the end of that, and actually where they got to the end of that in a lot of the cases was they got there and they were like, okay, we've got course outcomes, we've maybe got the start of some notes for degree outcomes, how the hell do we link this to assessment? And at that point everyone kind of went away for a little lie down because it felt like so much work and they didn't know. But the description of the English arrival, I actually wonder if to some extent Norway is a very similar thing, just at a different point in time. That there's a lot of willingness to give it a go with learning outcomes because there's an acceptance that teaching needs to be improved and we need to help students understand what they're learning. I sometimes worry there's not enough cynicism about them in Norway, that actually the other bits of them are being kind of accepted along with the package. And
so that's why I don't think it's sometimes the idea is there's a cynical use of them and sort of a well-meaning. I think actually the problem is that they draw one into a very mechanistic approach. And so actually people who have been completely not cynical, the angels, found themselves being more and more mechanistic because that's what they lead to. And, going back, the same with John Biggs, and, because really learning outcomes sit there in the whole constructive alignment. So I'm a big critic of constructive alignment. And, but recently when I heard John Biggs talk about when he started that as the maverick. He was the maverick speaking for all the things. That's not how constructive alignment currently is. It's now canon, and it's a mechanism, and thou shalt follow it. Completely not what he meant. And I think that's, in the end, why, for me, I will always come down against them, because I think it's very hard to escape being drawn into the mechanistic. No matter how much you try.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, so we'll leave it there. I'm going to keep it
point.
This room is available to 2:30, so we can carry on discussion till then. If you want, a copy of the PowerPoint and the video will be available on the department website soon. And the next seminar will take place in this room on Wednesday the 2nd of December, and it will be a postgraduate focused seminar for staff and students, and an email went around yesterday.
And please, as I said in that email, feedback from our postgrads is they highly value these as a once-a-term chance to really engage with members of the department. And so if you can come, it would be greatly appreciated, and it will also be a little bit of fun as well.
Okay, and finally, if we can thank Rachel again for such a stimulating presentation.
And can I say thank you very much? It's really nice to be here, and I'm finding it a really helpful environment for developing my ideas on the project. So thank you all, and thanks for having me. Brill.